Tom Zimmerman and Brian Houck. I tried hard there, Brian. I hope you appreciate. Tom is a senior principal researcher in the Productivity and Intelligence and Software Analysis team at Microsoft Research. He's best known for his research at Microsoft on systematic mining of version archives of bug databases to conduct studies and build tools for developers and managers. And Brian is a productivity engineer working in the Windows and Azure engineering systems team at Microsoft. And in the past year, he has done research on the effects of COVID on developers and how to increase productivity in the remote working environment. Today, they're going to talk to us about this topic, what is the future of work, and how to measure our productivity. Brian, Tom, the stage is yours. Have fun.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. Today, Brian and I are going to talk to you about the SPACE framework and how to measure developer productivity, and also what this means in the new future of work, where we had software engineers working remotely for the period of over a year. And you may think that developer productivity is straightforward, but it's actually much more complex and nuanced than you might realize. And today we will give you like a brief overview of a framework that we learned, that we designed to measure productivity. And we will also share some common misconceptions and how basically also how you can improve productivity while working remotely. So why is developer productivity important? It plays actually a key role in the overall success of any organization, and learning how to assess and measure productivity of your developers gives you a greater insight into your organization's work processes, capabilities, and it also helps you to identify blind spot. And as a result, you can actually work more efficiently in your company. You can also produce better software, and you can keep your developers happy. So it's important for everyone to think about developer productivity, for individual developers, but also for managers and the executives at companies. So we have a lot of experience of looking into developer productivity at Microsoft, and there are many myths and misconceptions that we've heard about over the past decades. And we just want to point this out because it's really important that you understand what productivity is, but also what productivity isn't, before you can actually be successful at measuring and predicting developer productivity. So here are 5 common myths that we keep hearing. Number 1 is productivity is all about developer activity. And I'm going to talk about the myths in more detail in a moment. Number 2 is productivity is only about individual performance. Number 3 is one productivity metric can tell you everything. Number 4, productivity measures are only useful for managers. And number 5, productivity comes down to engineering systems and developer tools. And all of these myths have been busted. So number 1, productivity is all about developer activity. That's not really true. But it's also the myth that we keep hearing the most when people talk about productivity. And one of the reasons is it's very easy to measure, to put together a measurement of productivity and feel good about it. But that's not really a successful strategy, because there are a lot of reasons why just measuring activity is not a good idea. So one of them is it's basically just an output measurement. So just because you put in more time just into something does not mean you accomplish more. But a lot of these activity measurements, they're basically very prone to developers working overtime. Excuse me. So basically, if a developer works more hours, they're more likely to have more activity and you think they're more productive. But in contrast, someone who works less might actually be more productive in reality. The other aspect is that if you just focus on measurements of activity, you might miss out on some important signals. So for example, common measurements for activity are just counting number of pull requests, commits, code reviews, but these don't give you insight into other really important activities like the benefits of collaboration or peer programming or brainstorming activity. And sometimes also higher activity is just the result of a better engineering system. So it doesn't mean your software engineers are much more productive now. Myth number 2, also busted, is that productivity is only about individual performance. And while an individual performance is really important, it also matters what the person contributes to the team. And you can think of it as software development as a team sports, like soccer or football or basketball. And while it's really important that you have strong individual players on your team, in the end, it matters that your team is winning and also what the individuals contributing to the team. So if you only let developers focus to optimize their own personal productivity, it might in the end hurt the team performance. So it's really important to find a good balance between individual and team performance and productivity, and also the organizational success, because in the end, you want to sell software to your customers. Myth number 3, and again, that's a very popular myth, is you can come up with like one productivity metric that can tell you everything. And this myth has been busted, and there's simply no universal metric for productivity. And the reason is because there are many different dimensions of work that you all have to capture when you want to think and measure about productivity, and also when you want to make decisions about productivity. And like some of the dimensions are satisfaction and well-being, performance, communication, activity, and flow. And what can happen is if you just optimize for activity, you really push your engineers to have a lot of commits and do many pull requests and code reviews. It might actually hurt the satisfaction of your engineers. It might also hurt the performance because you're introducing more bugs into the system. So it's really important to just look at many different dimensions when you think about productivity, and just using one single metric, it's very dangerous. The other thing to keep in mind is that the context in which the work is done can also make a big difference on productivity. So for example, if you think back about the last year with a pandemic, that certainly has an impact on productivity. And also it's something that you have to account for when you make decisions about productivity. Myth number 4 is that productivity measures are only useful for manager. Again, busted, not as true. And this comes down to a belief among a lot of developers that managers want to misuse productivity metrics or have misused them in the past or are measuring the wrong thing. And so that's not really, in most cases, this is not true. But the other thing to keep in mind is even if your manager is measuring productivity, it can be very useful for you personally to also look into your productivity and monitor your productivity. And it goes back to something which was introduced many years ago, the personal software process. So if you track your own productivity, it can help you in various ways. So first, it can give you like insights into your work, into what type of behaviors and what type of patterns make you more productive, make you more happy. It can also help your confidence, because sometimes you actually don't realize how much you accomplish when you are at work. So it's really useful to keep track of what you're doing. And as a result, by looking into your own productivity, it can also reduce the chance of burnout, and in the end, it can make you happier. And the last myth I want to point out is productivity comes down to engineering system and developer tools. And no question, engineering system and developer tools are really important, and maybe even the most important part of productivity, but it's not. There are many other aspects which you also have to take into account when you think about productivity, Like one of them is the environment in which the work takes place. So for example, if you think about private offices versus open space offices, there's a lot of discussion about how they impact productivity and in which ways. The other aspect that is also important is you want to think about how mentoring activity or knowledge sharing can help your productivity, because if you can just find information as opposed to just reinvent it, it's also going to boost your productivity. And lastly, the company morale and the work culture, these are also factors which we found to be very important with respect to productivity. So I've talked about 5 common myths, and to help you think about how to approach developer productivity and to reason about developer productivity, we recently proposed the SPACE framework, which basically measures 5 unique dimensions of work. And as a result, it gives us a more complete picture of what developer productivity actually looks like. And SPACE is short, it's an acronym for the 5 dimensions. We have satisfaction and well-being, we have performance, we have activity, we have communication and collaboration, and we have efficiency and flow. I'm now going to talk about each of them in a bit more detail. So satisfaction and well-being, these basically look into how fulfilled and happy developers are in their roles. And in the past, we found that research has shown that satisfaction and productivity are highly correlated. So it's a great opportunity to get a more holistic understanding of people's productivity. It's really hard to measure satisfaction automatically or with devices, at least until now. So that's where we usually recommend to do surveys among your development teams to find out how happy they are, how satisfied they are, and also solicit comments on what are areas that you can improve. The next dimension, performance, is related to the outcome of a system or a process. So you might think of performance as easy to measure. It's like just one number, or it's good or bad, success or unsuccessful, but it's actually a bit more nuanced. There are many different measurements of performance, because in the end, we want to ship code that our customer use in a satisfied way, and also that generates revenue for the company. So what we recommend is to look at least 2 different components of performance. Like one of them is the quality of the code. So how many bugs do you have in your system? How reliable is it? Are there only few service incidents? The other aspect, the other dimension is the impact of the code. And this is related to customer satisfaction, feature usage, and also customer retention. I've talked a lot about how activity is not a perfect measurement for productivity, but it still is a really important measurement as well. So because it can also give you good insight into what developers are working on. So here we recommend that you look into metrics related to design and coding. So basically for design, it would be like how many design documents people are writing. For coding, how many pull requests, work items, commits, code reviews developers are doing. We also recommend that you look into continuous integration and deployment. So for example, like how many builds, tests, and how many releases you can do. And then also at the activity of the system. So for example, like how many service incidents there are for your system. It's something you can look into. And for also injectable activities, like for example, like attending meetings, right? It's also an activity that if you can measure, it's a useful signal to have. The 4th dimension is communication and collaboration. And this really does take into account that even for creating software is an engineering activity, it's also a a largely creative engineering activity. So there are many different ways that you can get to one goal. And it's also taking into account that almost all software is now too big for a single person to be built. So really it's a team sport, and we want to make sure we have effective teams. And that's where you want to think about diversity, inclusion, transparency, and also flow of information. So measuring or quantifying communication and collaboration is a bit tricky. So this is where we recommend that you look at things like quality of team reviews, onboarding time, or integration speed. Efficiency and flow, this basically refers to like how efficient your processes are. So do you have only few handoffs in a process? Do your developers have the ability to stay in flow and work without any interruptions? So you might have heard the term being in flow, which means a developer can just focus on writing code. So here's like a nice image of the space framework, and it's really just to show you that the space of productivity, it's actually fairly large. I've pointed out the 5 different dimensions. The one thing I want to say is there are also different levels that you can look into these measurements. You can think of it in terms of one person, like the individual perspective, the team or group perspective, which is people working together, and then the system perspective, which is the entire, like, for example, like a development pipeline. So how would you use this framework? So the good thing is you don't need to cover everything in the table. So sometimes it can be useful just to look at like a small number of dimensions. So for example, if you want to find out how the commit behavior relates to satisfaction and flows. So here like 3 measurements that you could take a look at. You could collect satisfaction with engineering system from engineers through surveys. Then you look into the number of commits, and also look into lack of interruptions in coding time or flow through the system in general. Here's another example in terms of code review. And here we can actually cover all 5 dimensions very easily. So satisfaction with code reviews, again, could be collected with surveys. For performance, we could use the code review velocity, which is how quickly reviews are being completed. You could also look into how many reviews are being approved in the end. Activity, it's actually very simple. You just look at number of code reviews. For communication and collaboration, it's a bit more tricky. So one measurement could be to look into the thoughtfulness of reviews, the quality, and this can be, again, self-reported data, like reported data from developers, but you could also use some automatic NLP techniques. And then efficiency and flow, you want to look into like how efficiently a code review flows through the entire system. So how to use the framework? A few simple guidelines, like one of them is really measure metrics across more than one dimension. We recommend to look at least at 3 different dimensions, but also we encourage you to look at all 5 of the dimensions. It is really important to have a balanced set of metrics, and this will depend on your organization as well, and what the core values are of your organization. And that's why we also recommend that you review different metrics and not just, even within one dimension, it makes absolutely sense to have multiple metrics. Because in the end, the more varied the metrics are, the more balanced will be your picture of developer productivity. I briefly want to mention a few things to watch out for when using the framework. So one of them is really important is what type of metrics you select, and also how many metrics you select, because it basically signals what is important to you as an organization. And if you choose the wrong metrics, it also can upset your developers. Developer privacy is really important, that you respect the privacy, that you implement techniques to anonymize, aggregate results at the right level. And we don't recommend to use any of these measurements for things like compensation. Also to be something aware of is biases in the data. So an example of a bias that has been found for code review is researchers found gender bias. So for example, women often get more negative reviews in more negative comments in code reviews, even though the quality of the comments or the code is the same. And then you also want to think about how you normalize it. So what are appropriate time periods to normalize? And you also want to be aware of cultural norms, especially when you use perceptual data, because some cultures are more likely to give higher scores than others. And I'm now going to hand over to Brian, who is going to talk to you about how this has been applied over the past year with respect to the pandemic.
Thanks, Tom. So back in March of 2020, almost all of Microsoft's global work sites moved into a state of mandatory work from home. And this was a huge shift for Microsoft because Microsoft did not have a longstanding culture of remote work. So most of our developers were having to learn how to work remotely for the first time while also struggling through the challenges of a pandemic. And so what I want to talk to you about today is how we applied the concepts that you just heard about from Tom to understand how this shift impacted the productivity and well-being of our developers. And then what were we able to learn from that to try to make their experiences better? So in the early days of the pandemic, it was incredibly clear about why measuring developer productivity is so challenging. One quick second while I try to, there we go. So in the early days of the pandemic, measuring productivity it was very clear on why it was so challenging. What we saw was that activity was high. And so if you just look at something like what I have in the chart here, a comparison of completed pull requests. So what you're seeing in this chart is pull requests per person over the first 2 months of mandatory work from home compared to the same time period of 2019. And so if you were to just look at this, you would say, oh, productivity is high. Your developers are producing a lot. But the story was a lot more nuanced than that. If you went and talked to developers, you heard that output was coming at an incredibly high emotional and physical cost. They were working more hours and it was negatively impacting their well-being. And so satisfaction was very low. People were not enjoying their experiences. And so Tom and I wanted to better understand sort of some of those nuances of what was going on with our developers. And so we collaborated with some other amazing researchers in MSR, and we sent out a survey to 5,000 developers across Microsoft. And we asked them about what were the challenges that you were facing, as well as what were the benefits you were experiencing during the shift to remote work. And what we found is that those challenges and benefits really were two sides of the same coin. They were incredibly related. An example of that is many of our developers expressed that they loved the flexibility that remote work gave them as it related to their working hours. But we weren't able to apply that in a healthy way because our developers were also telling us that they weren't having a healthy work-life boundary. And what we also found was that our experiences varied dramatically, individual to individual. Some people felt that the shift to remote work allowed them to take more breaks throughout the day. And many people felt that it actually resulted in fewer breaks throughout the day. And even for a given individual, our experiences varied dramatically day to day. And so these percentages you see are the percentage of people who said that they experienced a given factor. And what you can see there is that's more than 100%, which means some people felt that they were having both less distractions during the shift to remote work and more distractions. And many of you may have felt this same thing too. But one thing really popped, not just from this study, but from additional work happening across Microsoft about this lack of work-life boundary. Burnout was a top concern, particularly early in the pandemic. And so one org solution to that, the Windows org, was to take a shared break. And so the Windows org, the Windows leadership decided to give the entire org a Friday and the following Monday off. as a shared opportunity for the entire org to step back, take a breath, recharge, and focus on their well-being. And we call these our health days. And what you can see in blue in the chart on the right is that over that Friday to Monday span that encompassed those health days, pull request volume was a third of what it was during that same corresponding 4-day span in 2019. And what that shows is that the org really did take that time off. There was substantially less activity happening. But what you see in orange there is that within just 14 days following those health days, the org had made up for all of the lost pull requests that had happened from taking those time off. So if I had zoomed out 2 weeks, I never would have been able to see that the org took time off from our activity data. So these health days didn't come at the cost of any of our activity. But it's not just that our developers immediately jumped back into a frantic pace of working and were burned out again. Burnout was not a top theme mentioned in our qualitative research for 14 weeks preceding those health days. And so it does provide evidence that there was meaningful relief to our developers, even though it didn't actually come at the cost of our engineering output. And this is just, for me, a great example of where investing in sort of the emotional well-being of our employees actually supports productivity, and we can use space to help prove that out. But we knew that not every cohort of engineers within Microsoft were having a good time. And so as the pandemic went on, and particularly as people got more used to working remotely, we saw that many people sentiment towards remote work in general was improving. But for certain groups, it was still staying fairly negative. And one of those were our new hires. We were struggling to onboard new hire software engineers. And a warning sign in our activity data was pull requests within the first 90 days of a new hire start date. And we saw that they were down 23% compared to new hires who joined during the same time period of 2019. Now, as Tom mentioned, output measures like pull requests is not a great overall proxy for productivity, but this was a pretty stark warning sign that our software engineering new hires were really struggling to complete work. And it's not just that they were struggling to complete work, it's that they were really struggling to connect. And so one of the things that I did is I looked at comparing new hires who joined in the 6 months immediately before the shift to mandatory work from home compared to those new hires who joined during the first 6 months of mandatory work from home. And what I found is that those new hires who joined during mandatory work from home were connecting substantially less to substantially fewer people than those new hires who had even a short amount of time to build social capital face-to-face. And it's not just that we see it objectively in our communication telemetry, our new hires felt it too, and they were telling us. Only a third of our new hires felt socially connected to the team. And 40% of our software engineering new hires said that they didn't even have at least one-on-one interaction with someone on the team every day. And that led to them feeling incredibly isolated and disconnected from their team. And so what we did is we went and talked to teams that did seem to be having more positive outcomes. And so using space, we were able to identify teams that didn't see that these drop-offs in communication, collaboration, and activity. And we went and asked, well, what are you doing different? And from that, we were able to come up with some key tips, some key themes from these high-performing teams. And there are some tips that are good for everyone to know when they're thinking about building a healthy culture for new software engineers. And one is just about normalizing asking for help. It's one thing if you are in an office environment and a new hire can just, stop next door and say, hey, I've got this quick question. But when you're all remote and it takes a little more formality to ask a question, having a team culture where that's okay to ask questions and you don't have to feel like you're distracting someone to ask for help is incredibly important. And anything that teams can do to emphasize team building and growing that team connectedness, that social connectedness, seems to yield more positive outcomes. And then for managers of software engineering new hires, we found it was just incredibly important to assign a dedicated person to help not just onboard the new hire to the team from a cultural perspective, but also from a technical perspective. And that just provided yet another opportunity for connectedness for those new hires. And then the importance of one-on-ones, meeting the new hire meeting one-on-one directly with their manager has just been like further accentuated during this period of remote work. We've actually seen broadly at Microsoft that those engineers who report regularly having one-on-ones with their direct manager are in fact 2.5 times more likely to report that they have maintained or increased their productivity during the shift to remote work. And that appears to be even more true for our new hires who need that additional support for prioritization and to get unblocked. And then, as I mentioned, time to first PR and count of PRs within the first 90 days dramatically fell off during the shift to remote work. And that was a problem for our new hires because they felt this anxiety of not getting like that first assignment done. And what one new hire told me is, you know, until I completed that first pull request, I couldn't even speak the language of the team. And so providing a scope first assignment seemed to help that in order to just like alleviate that initial project's anxiety. And so the org I'm in has about 4,500 engineers. It's fairly large. I sit within the Azure organization. And we implemented not only that guidance, but some additional new policies in order to help support onboarding our new software engineers. And using Space, we were able to validate those results. And so we have seen over the last 6 months that time to first PR has improved by 33%. Compared to the time period directly before this. And we've actually seen a 68% increase in one-on-ones between new hires and their direct managers, count of one-on-ones. And as we would hypothesize, we then have also seen now much more robust satisfaction with our onboarding processes from our new hires. And I really view this as a success case for Space, where we leveraged the principles of Space to identify problems that was coming out of our developer productivity data from across multiple dimensions. We created sort of a multi-dimension approach to solving those problems. And then we're able to then use Space again to help us validate that those interventions worked. And so, it's from things like this that have allowed us to have a deep understanding of what have been the top challenges during the shift to remote work, how do we address them, in order to make not only our experiences better now, but as we start looking to shifting towards a more hybrid form of working, where some people are in the office some days, some people are working remotely, and that ratio is fluid. It's leveraging Space will help us understand what's working, what needs further tweaking, and what can we go and do to make the lives of our developers better so that they can be, you know, more productive and also happier in their jobs and hopefully more likely to stay at Microsoft. And so with that, I would just like to call out work like this. It takes a village. Tom and I have been involved in everything here on the screen, but along with partnering with just a whole host of incredible researchers, want to call that out and thank them for all of their hard work. And so with that, we're done and happy to take questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this great talk. You definitely get a clap on Zoom from me. Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, we have a couple of questions rolling in, so let's jump right into it. First question comes from Tamesh. Is there a right amount, in quotes, of measures to collect? How can we prevent leads fall into the pit of willing to measure everything?
Tom, you want to take that one, or you want me to give a crack at it?
You go ahead.
So I will say it's different for the audience, right? And I think a trap that many engineering teams fall into is saying, hey, we're going to have one set of measures that we care about, and we're going to use that to articulate success up the management chain, as well as sort of help us identify investments and improvements we can make locally, sort of down at the team level. And I will say that the right number is the maximum number of measurements where you can actually do something actionable with that data. And so like measuring everything may be academically interesting, but if there isn't someone who can actually go and take action on that, either by making a tooling investment to remove some roadblock that you see in the data, making a cultural or organizational change, then it's no good to collect that measure, or at least not to report on it regularly. So I will say in my division, as an example, which again, it's fairly large, it's 4,500 engineers. We have sort of 5 top-level metrics that cover, as you would expect, a broad range of dimensions. We certainly leverage the space concepts. And within the engineering system team, we collect a lot more data. And we may look at 10 to 15 different metrics more regularly to help us identify specific tooling investments. But in terms of like core metrics, we have a set of 5 because we have found that is the most that our leadership can sort of page into memory and action and reason over. Mm-hmm. But it is different for every team.
Yeah, thank you. Next question comes from Dominic. Have you got numbers on how hybrid teams perform? Are they less productive than purely co-located or purely remote teams?
I can take that one too, and Tom, feel free to jump in for some additional color. So unfortunately, we don't have conclusions for that yet. There are some indications that teams who are in hybrid, much like the shift to remote work, have a unique set of challenges and benefits. We have seen that on some hybrid teams, satisfaction is going up, but that like actually overall work hours are higher than they were pre-pandemic. And so I think much like the shift to remote work has required teams to figure out new ways of working, new paradigms, we are just now starting to see teams globally move to a hybrid form of work. And it is still a relatively small percentage of our total workforce here at Microsoft. And so we're still in early days of even collecting data. And so it's leveraging many of the techniques we use to understand the shift to remote work to begin with. We'll have to reapply those during hybrid, but until we have more teams globally moving to hybrid, we just don't know yet.
This is science. It takes time.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Tom, you want to add something?
No, yeah, I mean, we're gonna find out in the next couple of months, hopefully, what hybrid work means. But I think it's going to be, I expect that it's going to be initially like, I think actually going to be harder on productivity, because it's, I think what was one thing why this remote work was actually worked out somewhat is that everyone had to work remotely, so everyone had the same setup. But now once there's this hybrid setup, you're going to face some people are going to be co-located at the same location, and some of them are going to be remote. So there's going to be, I would expect, a much harder toll on communication and collaboration in terms of the space framework.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like just to add, like it's going to change over time. As Tom mentioned, everybody shifted to work remotely at almost the exact same time, versus with hybrid, it's going to be fluid. And I would expect the ratio, the amount that someone may work remotely is going to shift over time while everyone is finding the right balance for them, as well as employers get more or less comfortable with remote work.
Yeah, thank you for this detailed answer, guys. There's, I guess, an easy question coming from Dominic, but it's very popular. Are you going to keep remote working in Microsoft?
So the Microsoft policy moving forward is incredibly more supportive of remote work than it was previously, where, like I said, most people at Microsoft came into work every single day. And so moving forward, the standard policy is everyone has flexibility to work remotely 50% of the time. And then there are a lot more accommodations for those who would like to work more, remotely more permanently. And so like Microsoft is truly embracing this hybrid model. And we've seen that over 90% of our employees want to work remotely at some cadence moving forward, and the company is being supportive of that.
Thank you. The next question comes from Joel. Who do you think should measure these metrics in an organization? As a developer, would it make sense to measure my individual metrics using Space? Maybe Tom, you can take this one.
Yeah, I think it does. And so one thing we found is we've been doing several diary and reflection studies in various projects over the past few years, and we've seen consistently that reflecting on your own work that helps you with goal achievement and also like being more productive. And so the short answer is yes, it's definitely useful. There was actually recently a GitHub project which was doing a reflection study, which was using the Space framework, and they also found significant benefits to using Space for individual productivity. So if you do an internet search for GitHub and Good Day project, you should be able to find the research I was just talking about.
Thank you, Tom. Next question comes from Ochoa. How did you get the idea of measuring exactly code reviews with Space? Are there some things that you continuously measure with this system?
So what was the first part?
How did you get the idea of measuring exactly code reviews with Space?
Oh, specifically about code reviews? Oh,
I guess, yes.
It was one example that we can measure, and it's in a way it's a more illustrative example because it's very prominent. Like code reviews are very prominent, and what's nice about the code review example is it's fairly straightforward to cover all 5 space dimensions. Yeah. So for certain aspects, covering all 5 space dimensions might be a bit harder, but for code reviews, it just perfectly fit.
Yeah, actually, yeah, if you think about it, it's one of the 4 core metrics that GitHub also measures on your activity on GitHub. So, yeah. Next question, maybe. Are you guys going to publish your findings on hybrid teams somewhere? Ishpan asks.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the findings will be published somewhere. And we've published like the slide that Brian put up actually had already some pointers to some of the work that we've already published about remote work. And I just want to point out like how quickly, how big it was. Like for like 50 different projects all across Microsoft, looking at the impact of remote work. And many of these continue to work at hybrid work. So there's going to be a lot of research coming out of Microsoft on basically hybrid work and more general how we work in the future.
Thank you for this because it helps all of us. All right, and I think that's going to conclude our Q&A. Brian, Tom, thank you for the amazing, exciting talk.